Imagine living on a quiet farm, surrounded by endless fields and forests. Your nearest neighbor is half a mile away. At night, when the wind dies down, the silence feels heavy. Every creak of the wood, every rustle outside seems louder, sharper. Now imagine hearing footsteps above your head in the attic, when you know every member of your family is sitting right beside you. This isn't the beginning of a horror movie. It's the true story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, one of the most chilling unsolved crimes in history. A case where an entire family was slaughtered in their own home, and evidence suggests that their killer didn't just vanish into the night. He may have lived among their corpses for days afterward. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead sat in a remote patch of Bavaria, Germany, in 1922. The home belonged to Andreas Gruber, 63 years old, and his wife, Cecilia, who was 72. Living with them was their widowed daughter, Victoria, in her 30s, along with her 2 children, little Cecilia, just 7 years old, and Joseph, barely 2. They weren't entirely alone. A maid named Maria had just arrived to work in the household. Her first day on the farm would also be her last. Life on Hinterkaifeck was quiet and routine. Chores started at dawn. Animals needed feeding. Bread was baked daily, and the work never really stopped. But in the weeks before the murders, strange things began to disturb the Grubers' simple life. One day, Andreas noticed a set of footprints in the snow. They led straight from the forest, across the yard, and into the house. Yet there were no footprints leading back. Someone had approached the farmhouse and never seemed to leave. Soon after, the family began hearing noises at night. The thuds and soft movements came from the attic, as though someone was pacing above them. Despite searching, Andreas could find no intruder. The mysteries piled up. Keys to the house vanished without explanation. One morning, the family found a newspaper on the porch, a paper none of them subscribed to, and none of them had purchased. No one in the area recognized it. The atmosphere in the home grew tense. The farm's maid became so unsettled by the noises and strange events that she quit her job, telling friends and neighbors she believed the farm was haunted. Only days later, a new maid, Maria, was hired. She arrived at Hinterkaifeck on March 31st, 1922, the very day the killings began. That night, something or someone lured the family out to the barn. Andreas went first. Then his wife, Cecilia. Victoria followed. And finally, little Cecilia, just 7 years old. One by one, they were ambushed inside the barn and struck down with a mattock, a heavy farming tool with a blade sharp enough to cut and crush. Each body was found stacked on top of the other, covered with hay, as if the killer wanted to conceal them temporarily. But the horror wasn't over. The murderer entered the farmhouse and killed the remaining 2 occupants. Joseph, the youngest, was discovered in his crib. His short life ended before it could truly begin. Maria, the new maid, was killed in her bedroom, murdered within hours of arriving at her new job. In a single night, 6 lives were erased. The killings were brutal enough. But what came after is what truly cements the Hinterkaifeck case as one of the darkest in history. For days following the murders, smoke curled lazily from the farmhouse chimney. The animals in the barn were fed and tended to. Fresh loaves of bread were baked. A neighbor later swore he saw someone's shadow moving through the kitchen window. The implication was chilling. The killer hadn't simply murdered the family and fled. He stayed. He slept in their beds. He ate their food. He cared for their animals. And all the while, the 6 bodies lay cold and silent just a few feet away. It wasn't until April 4th, when neighbors grew suspicious of the family's absence, that the crime was uncovered. They entered the barn first, expecting perhaps an illness or accident, only to find the bodies buried in hay. Then, inside the farmhouse, the full scope of the massacre was revealed. The horror spread quickly through Bavaria. A crime this savage, this bizarre, was unlike anything anyone had ever heard of. Police descended on the farm, launching one of the largest investigations in German history. But the more they searched, the stranger the case became. There were no signs of robbery. Money and valuables were still in the house. The murders were precise, deliberate. Whoever had done this seemed less like a stranger passing through, and more like someone who knew the family, knew their routines, and perhaps had lived among them before. Dozens of suspects were questioned. Victoria's ex-lover was a prime suspect, with some suggesting jealousy and resentment had driven him to commit the murders. Other theories pointed to disgruntled neighbors or enemies Andreas may have made, as he was rumored to be a harsh, unpopular man. Some suggested farmhands or drifters, strangers who happened upon the isolated farmhouse and seized the opportunity. But there was never enough evidence to convict anyone. The case grew darker the deeper investigators looked. Rumors spread that Andreas had an abusive history and that Victoria had endured years of suffering. Some whispered that Joseph, the youngest child, was not fathered by Victoria's late husband, but by Andreas himself. Was the crime born of jealousy, vengeance, or revenge for family secrets that festered too long? Or was it something colder, a calculated killing by someone outside the family circle, who found shelter and comfort in the home of his victims until the heat grew too strong? Over the decades, theories multiplied. Some insisted the murders bore the mark of organized crime, carried out with ritualistic precision. Others believed it was the work of a vagrant who stumbled onto the farm, though the calculated aftermath suggests otherwise. Many argued the killer was someone close, someone who knew where the animals were kept, how the house ran, and how to keep the farm appearing alive for days after the family was already dead. Despite confessions, arrests, and endless speculation, no one was ever brought to justice. The killer vanished, leaving behind only silence, legend, and a farmhouse that has since been torn down. Though some claim the land itself still feels cursed, the Hinterkaifeck murders endure as one of the most haunting mysteries in true crime. A family slaughtered in their own home. A killer who may have slept beneath their roof, listened to the silence of his victims, and calmly lived among the dead. What truly happened that night in Bavaria remains unknown. Was it a jealous lover, a vengeful neighbor, or a faceless wanderer who disappeared into the forest forever? Or is it possible the killer was someone they trusted, someone who had been inside the house long before the murders ever began? Nearly a century later, the questions remain. And perhaps the most chilling part is this: whoever killed the Grubers may have walked away from Hinterkaifeck into the darkness, never to be seen again, taking the truth with him. What do you think happened that night? Like and subscribe for more true crime content.